A violent storm, a stranded military team, a remote farmhouse becomes their only refuge. But when the farmer spots a familiar badge among their gear, his hands go cold. Could one of these men have saved his life decades ago without ever knowing it? The wind had a voice that night, not a whistle or a howl, but a deep, guttural moan that rolled across the fields and pressed against the windows of the Thornton farmhouse like something alive. James stood at the kitchen sink, his rough hands gripping the porcelain edge as he stared out into the blackness. Sheets of rain lashed the land, turning the dirt road into a river of mud. In the distance, the faint glimmer of the barn lights flickered like dying stars. Angela placed a steaming mug of chamomile tea beside him. "You won't sleep tonight, will you?" she asked, her voice calm despite the chaos outside. James didn't look away from the window. Storm like this, something always happens. He wasn't wrong. Just as the clock struck 9, the low growl of an engine pierced through the storm. It was barely audible at first, like a wounded animal caught in the wind. But then, a hard metallic crunch followed. James dropped the mug, and it shattered on the floor. Angela gasped. That was close. Without a word, James grabbed his coat and flashlight, slipped on his boots, and was out the door before she could stop him. The beam of his flashlight wavered in the wind, barely cutting through the sheets of rain. He reached the edge of his property where the gravel road curved dangerously by a steep ditch. There, tilted sideways and half submerged in mud, was a military transport truck, camouflage green and marked with fresh streaks of dirt. James squinted. The headlights flickered weakly. One of the rear tires was spinning aimlessly. "Anybody hurt?" he shouted. A figure emerged from the passenger side. Young, maybe mid-20s, drenched head to toe. "We're all right. Just stuck. Road gave out under us." More figures climbed out, their boots sinking into the mud. 6 in total, 5 soldiers, and 1 older man who stepped out more slowly. He moved with purpose, but also with the caution of someone who knew exactly what a bad fall on wet ground could do at his age. "We saw the lights from your barn," the younger soldier continued. "Didn't expect anyone out here." James waved them forward. "Come on. You'll catch your death standing in this." He didn't need to say it twice. The men grabbed whatever gear they could carry and followed the beam of James' flashlight back toward the house. Angela had already thrown extra logs in the fireplace and laid out towels on the table. The warmth hit the soldiers like a wall when they stepped inside, and for a moment, no one spoke. They just breathed. That kind of silence, the kind that only comes when life suddenly feels safe again. Angela gave a motherly nod to each man, then guided them to the kitchen. "Take off your boots. I don't care how muddy they are, but you're not tracking that into my living room," she said with a smile. James peeled off his soaked coat and hung it by the door. "Angela, this here's— I don't even know your names yet," he said, turning to the group. The youngest stepped forward. "Lieutenant Roy Danner, sir. Supply Transport Unit. These are my men. That's Corporal Hughes, Private Lane, Specialist Morano, and Sergeant Evans. And the gentleman who knows every back road in the county is Carl." Carl stepped forward, offering a firm handshake. He was maybe in his 60s, gray in the beard, but there was steel in his eyes. "Carl Benson," he said. "I'm just riding along. These boys get lost if the GPS blinks." James chuckled. "Well, you found the one place the GPS never heard of." Angela handed out bowls of stew, and soon the kitchen was filled with the clink of spoons, the hiss of wet socks steaming by the fire, and the quiet sound of soldiers shedding the weight of command, if only for a night. The conversation flowed easily. Roy explained their mission, delivering emergency supplies to a flood-stricken town 3 counties over. The storm had pushed them off course. Angela listened attentively, her eyes lingering on Carl from time to time. There was something about him, maybe the way he didn't speak unless necessary, or how he watched the room like someone always measuring the exits. She couldn't place it, but it felt familiar. "You were military too?" she asked gently, refilling his tea. Carl gave a nod. "Long time ago." James raised an eyebrow. "Where'd you serve?" "Vietnam. 1970 to 72. James froze for a second. "Me too. 70 to late 71. Mekong Delta. Their eyes met. Just for a moment. It wasn't tension, it was something older. Recognition without confirmation. Two ghosts looking at each other from opposite ends of the same battlefield. But neither man said more. The storm outside carried the rest of the conversation forward, sweeping away what lingered. Later that night, James walked Carl to the guest room. "Appreciate what you did out there. Helping those boys," James said. As James turned to head back down the hall, a flash of something caught his eye through the cracked door. On top of Carl's rucksack was a worn piece of cloth wrapped tightly around what looked like an old badge. James looked at it for a moment longer than he should have, and then continued walking. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the Thornton home, something long buried was beginning to stir. Shadows of a past neither man had fully left behind. And whether by fate or chance, they were about to face it. Together. The storm hadn't let up. If anything, it had grown fiercer. Now a constant thrum against the windows and roof, like the heartbeat of the land itself in panic. James had barely managed to drift off when a crackle from the two-way radio on the kitchen shelf snapped him awake. "This is Will Greer from Route 19. If anyone hears this, James, you there? That old bridge over Hollow Creek's about to go. It's buckling. Jesus, I just barely got back before the whole thing gave." James was already halfway down the stairs, barefoot and moving fast. He reached the kitchen, turned up the volume, and pressed the mic. "Will? You all right?" Static. Then, "Yeah. But someone's truck is still out on the far side. If that bridge goes, they're done for." James didn't hesitate. He turned to find Carl already in the hallway, fully dressed, boots laced. Behind him, the rest of the young soldiers were starting to stir, their instincts trained to respond to urgency even in unfamiliar homes. Roy appeared, eyes barely open. "What's going on?" "Bridge near Hollow Creek's about to collapse," James said, already pulling on his coat. "Someone's out there, maybe stuck on the other side." "I'm going." "We're going," Carl corrected, his voice firm but even. Angela appeared behind them, worry in her eyes. "James," he kissed her cheek. "We'll be back. Keep the coffee hot." The drive was a crawl. The country road had become a winding trail of mud, puddles the size of bathtubs opening up where the gravel had washed away. Roy took the wheel of the Humvee while James and Carl guided him with shouted directions between thunderclaps. As they approached the bridge, the headlights lit up a haunting scene. Timbers groaning, sagging under the weight of water and age. On the far side, a pickup truck's lights blinked through the rain. Trapped. James jumped out first, sloshing into ankle-deep mud. "Will!" he shouted into the night. A flashlight flicked on across the bridge. "James? That you?" Carl studied the structure, his eyes darting across each beam like he was back in the jungle, evaluating a field crossing under fire. "We have maybe 15 minutes before this gives," he said. "Less if the river rises again." The team didn't need a speech. They moved like clockwork, laying boards, reinforcing the crack supports with chains, steel rods, even fallen branches lashed together with straps from their gear. Carl moved among them silently, like a field commander, pointing, checking knots, listening to the bridge creak beneath their feet. James grunted as he hammered in a wedge with the back of a crowbar. "Feels like old times." Carl didn't look up. "Let's make sure we have more time." They'd barely finished when the truck's engine roared to life. The neighbor, a farmer named Blake, edged forward. The bridge whined, but held. When he made it across, he jumped out, panting. "I thought I was done for." James clapped him on the shoulder. "You just bought this bridge another few hours of life." Blake looked around at the soaked, muddy crew. "I owe you boys a drink. Hell, I owe you a case." Carl stepped back into the shadows, watching the scene but not joining in. By the time they made it back to the Thornton house, dawn was still far off and the rain hadn't let up. Angela had towels laid out again, and the coffee pot was working overtime. She moved like a small whirlwind, scolding them for tracking mud but smiling all the while. James sank into a kitchen chair with a groan. His joints ached, but his spirit felt clearer than it had in years. Angela returned with a tray of fresh cornbread and set it down on the table, but instead of sitting, she disappeared for a moment, then came back with something in her hands. Plastic sleeve yellowed with age. It was an old black and white photo. 12 men in uniform, muddy and grinning, leaning on rifles and sandbags. "My husband's old unit," she said. "He never talks much about those years, but I found this in the attic not long ago. Do any of you recognize anyone?" The room quieted. Roy leaned forward, curious. Hughes and Morano looked at the picture with polite interest. Carl stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, watching. Angela smiled and stepped toward him. "What about you, Carl?" Carl took the photo carefully. His hands, which hadn't trembled even when lifting beams on the bridge, now hesitated. He didn't speak, but something in his eyes shifted. James noticed. He watched Carl examine the image with a quiet intensity, his thumb pausing over a face, just for a heartbeat. Angela took the photo back and set it beside the coffee cups. "Anyway," she said gently, "thought you boys might like seeing it." James got up to help her, brushing past Carl. As he reached for a dish towel, his eyes landed on Carl's bedroll resting on the hall bench. A piece of cloth had come loose, revealing something beneath it. Tucked in the folds was a worn, distinct military badge. Not just any medal, it was hand-etched, shaped like an eagle, with markings that James hadn't seen since 1971. Specific, personal, rare. His breath caught. Carl, noticing James's pause, turned slightly. Their eyes met, just for a moment. There was no smile, no alarm, just something weighty, unspoken. James stepped back, saying nothing. He wiped his hands, grabbed his coffee, and rejoined the others. Outside, the wind had died down slightly, but inside, the tension had begun to build. Not one of conflict, but of memory. A sense that something deeply important had almost been said. Angela touched James's shoulder gently as he sat down again. "You all right?" He nodded slowly, watching Carl across the room. "Yeah, just remembering something I thought I forgot." Morning came quietly, like a truce. The storm had thinned into a slow drizzle, and the trees outside swayed softly, their leaves dripping in rhythm. Inside the Thornton home, the atmosphere was subdued but warm, the way it feels after something important has happened, even if no one quite knows what. Angela moved through the kitchen humming faintly, her hands full of mugs. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with damp wool and wood smoke. The soldiers had shed their uniforms and boots, lounging now in flannel shirts and borrowed socks. James sat at the table, silent, watching the steam rise from his cup. Carl stood by the window, quiet as ever, his eyes scanning the mist-covered hills beyond the barn. The photograph still lay on the table. Angela had tucked it inside a glass tray to keep it dry. The image of the platoon, grimy, tired, alive, looked out across the decades like a forgotten memory waiting for permission to speak. Carl finally stepped away from the window. His boots made no sound on the old wooden floor. Without a word, he picked up the photo. Carl studied the faces one by one, his brow slowly furrowing. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, with a calm so deep it almost sounded casual, he tapped the edge of the photo. "I was there." James raised his head. Carl pointed at a figure lying on a stretcher in the background of the picture. The photo was faded, the details murky, but it was unmistakably a man in bandages, his face turned away, his body slack with unconsciousness. "That was you, wasn't it?" Carl asked quietly. James stared at the image. He couldn't speak. Carl sat down slowly, placing the photo in front of James, rotating it so it faced him. "It was March 1971, Quang Tri Province," Carl began. "Your platoon had gone missing. Intel said it was an ambush, but no one expected it to be that bad. They sent us in 2 days later. By the time we got there, only 4 were still breathing. The room had gone silent. Even Roy, who usually filled gaps with jokes, sat frozen. I remember smoke, shrapnel everywhere. Jungle lit up like a thunderstorm. We carried the wounded back one by one. I took you last," Carl said. his voice barely above a whisper now. You were half gone. Didn't say a word. But I wasn't going to leave you there. James blinked slowly, his mouth slightly open. I always remembered flashes, sounds, being lifted, my boots dragging. But I never saw your face. Carl looked down. I was transferred the next morning. Never even knew your name. I only remembered the weight of you, the way your dog tags jingled. I kept thinking, this one's still warm. Keep walking. Angela stepped back, hand to her mouth. James sat motionless. He reached for the photo again, stared at it like it had just begun to breathe. You've been in my dreams, James murmured. All these years. That moment, I thought it was a ghost, or something my brain made up to fill the hole. But it was you. Carl didn't respond immediately. He took a long sip of coffee, his hands steady. I recognized the photo last night, he admitted. Didn't want to speak until I was sure. Then I saw your eyes this morning, and I knew. You were the last one I pulled out of that place. James exhaled, the sound caught between a laugh and a sob. He leaned back, pressing both hands to his face. You saved my life, he said, voice thick. And I never thanked you. Carl shook his head. That's not why I carried you. Angela came forward quietly and placed her hand on James's shoulder. For a long while, no one spoke. It wasn't just the memory they were sitting with. It was something larger, something that had waited over 50 years to be spoken aloud. James looked up at Carl again. You never told anyone? Carl shrugged softly. Was just doing what we were trained to do. But I always wondered if you made it. James leaned forward, both elbows on the table, and stared at Carl like trying to memorize him. I did, he said. I made it home, built a life, married Angela, bought this land, drove trucks for 20 years. Then I started farming. Carl nodded slowly. Then it was worth it. Silence settled again, not uncomfortable, just full. Outside, the sun began to break through the clouds, casting long golden streaks across the wet fields. Roy cleared his throat gently. Well, hell, he said. Didn't expect to cry before breakfast. Angela chuckled, wiping her eyes. Let's eat something before all this turns us into puddles. The group rose, slowly shifting toward the kitchen counter, plates and laughter returning bit by bit. But James and Carl stayed seated just a moment longer. Between them lay a photo, a memory, and a badge that had never been meant to bind, but had. And now, at last, it had brought two lives full circle. The sun finally returned. Not bold, not dramatic, just gentle. It crept through the thinning clouds, stretched across the soaked fields, and wrapped the Thornton farm in the kind of light that feels like permission to breathe again. By mid-morning, the house was filled with the rustle of gear and the clatter of boots. The young soldiers were packing up, their truck cleaned and restocked, the bridge repair still muddy on their clothes. James shook each hand with quiet pride, his weathered fingers gripping theirs with firm gratitude. Angela hugged them all, insisting they leave with bags of homemade jerky and jars of peach preserves. Roy tried not to cry and failed halfway through a joke. Then it was just the three of them, James, Angela, and Carl, watching the truck disappear down the road, taillights blinking into the mist. You sure you don't want to ride with them? James asked, glancing sideways. Carl gave a half-smile. Got nowhere to be for a few more hours. Besides, you said something about that old barn roof needing a second pair of eyes. Angela grinned and waved them both off. Go. I'll have lunch ready when you're done playing heroes again. The barn was quiet, its red paint faded and peeling, the wood swollen from the rain. Inside, it smelled of old hay, motor oil, and years of stories soaked into the beams. The two men worked in companionable silence, moving crates, hammering down loose planks, talking only when necessary. They didn't need words to share the weight between them. At one point, Carl stepped outside, phone in hand. He walked to the edge of the field, dialing slowly, staring out across the wet grass. Back inside, James kept working. He paused now and then, catching himself looking at Carl through the open doors, trying to process what it meant to finally know. To have a name, a face, a living person attached to the moment that haunted him for decades. He'd imagined the man countless times over the years. Always a blur, always silent. And now here he was, in his barn, fixing loose boards and swatting flies. Shortly after dawn, as dew glistened on every surface, a car crunched up the gravel road. It wasn't a soldier's vehicle. A civilian courier stepped out with an envelope in hand. Angela met him at the door. "Mr. Thornton?" "No, ma'am. It's for Mr. Carl Benson." She turned to call out, but Carl was already walking up the steps, wiping his hands on an old rag. He thanked the courier, took the envelope, and held it for a moment before speaking. "I asked my daughter to dig something up from the file cabinet in my study," he said. "Didn't think I'd ever need it again." James watched as Carl opened the envelope carefully, hands steady. Inside was a set of worn pages, faded, yellowed, edges curling slightly. The header read, "After Action Report, Operation Ember Wind, March 1971. Carl handed the packet to James without a word. James took it slowly, as if holding something fragile. He sat down, laid the papers on the table, and began to read. Line by line, name by name, the past opened up like a wound that had never fully healed. He whispered each name aloud, voice cracking, hands trembling. Seeing their faces, remembering their jokes, their cigarettes, the way they'd walked, the nicknames they hated. He paused on one. Corporal Duncan. He took shrapnel in the side. "Wouldn't stop singing Sinatra the whole way out," James murmured. Carl chuckled softly. "Thought I imagined that." James looked up, his eyes shining. He was real. They were all real. "I haven't said some of these names out loud in 50 years. Angela sat beside him, hand on his back, eyes misted. "Thank you," James said suddenly, voice catching. Carl met his gaze. "I've thought about this moment more times than I can count," James continued. "In the hospital, at night, when I looked at my kids, when I was building this place. I used to lie in bed and practice what I'd say if I ever met the man who carried me out of hell." He paused, swallowed hard, then leaned forward. "And now that I have the chance, I don't want to mess it up, so I'll just say it plain." He reached across the table and laid a hand on Carl's arm. "Thank you for saving me." Carl didn't speak. He simply nodded, eyes red-rimmed, jaw tight. Then he stood. James rose too. The two men embraced, not politely, not quickly. It was the kind of hug that draws from the spine, that cracks something open. Two brothers bound not by blood, but by war. Not by family, but by survival. Not by what they remembered, but by what they had never forgotten. Angela stood quietly nearby, wiping her cheeks. "I never thought I'd see the day," she whispered. "And I'm so glad I did." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds completely. The fields glistened. The trees stood tall. The wind had calmed. And somewhere deep in the silence, a ghost finally rested. This story reminds us that some debts live quietly in the heart, waiting for the right moment to be repaid. What would you say to the person who once saved your life? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more powerful true-to-life stories. See you in the next video.